I want you to picture a scene and really try to put yourself in this specific environment.
Mm-hmm.
It is January in the year 2025. You are standing outside at the Vartius border crossing station in Finland.
Right, way up there.
Yeah, and the landscape is entirely swallowed by winter. Like, it is desolate, and the ambient temperature is sitting at a brutal negative 27 degrees Celsius.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that is the kind of cold where every breath physically aches in your chest, and your primary concern is honestly just maintaining body heat.
Well, and operating any kind of, advanced electronic hardware in those conditions is just a total nightmare.
Right.
Liquid crystal displays, they just freeze solid. Batteries lose their voltage capacity within a matter of minutes.
Yeah, they just drain instantly.
Exactly. Even the lubricants in mechanical parts turn into this sort of thick sludge.
Yeah.
So the environment itself is actively fighting your attempt to maintain any kind of digital footprint.
Right. It's entirely hostile. But sitting in the middle of this freezing expanse is a fairly standard, unassuming Ford Transit van. Okay.
And beside this van is a metal pole standing exactly 3.8 meters tall in the snow.
Yeah.
Mounted right at the top of that pole is a commercial Starlink satellite terminal, the exact kind you could just order online for your house.
Right, a civilian dish.
Exactly. But the detail that makes this entire image so surreal is the geography.
Right.
Less than 1 single meter away from where this civilian dish is tracking satellites in the sky is the Russian border.
Yeah, it is an incredibly tense image, especially when you consider the geopolitical reality of 2025.
Yeah.
Because, this isn't just some tech stunt. You are looking at a literal trial for national survival.
Right.
The researchers who are operating that dish out in the freezing cold, they were testing a really desperate, highly pragmatic solution to a terrifying question, which is, what happens when the ground beneath our feet, digitally speaking, just completely gives way? What happens when an entire nation goes dark during a crisis?
And that terrifying question is actually the entire focus of our deep dive today.
Yeah. Because we are exploring this absolutely fascinating research framework created for the Finnish Ministry of Transport and Communications.
Right.
And the mission here is to evaluate the viability of low Earth orbit satellites, specifically commercial networks like Starlink for state preparedness. Basically, how do you keep a society functioning when the standard grid collapses?
Well, because state preparedness is it's the absolute baseline functionality of a civilization, right?
Yeah.
If your city's terrestrial network just vanishes this afternoon, how do emergency instructions even reach you?
Exactly.
How do the national broadcasters stay on the air to coordinate an evacuation or issue shelter-in-place warnings? I mean, without that flow of information, a localized emergency just immediately cascades into widespread panic.
Right. And we have a really remarkable stack of sources guiding us through this today. We're looking at research excerpts titled AO Satellites in State Preparedness. And this was a collaborative study. It was conducted by the Finnish Broadcasting Company, which is known as YAIL, alongside the National Emergency Supply Agency and Traficom.
Right. But we also have these incredible, almost philosophical notes and technical logs from the actual researcher who engineered this border test.
Yes, Mika Seppi.
Exactly. Mika Seppi, who is the head of technology at Frummen, the tech branch of the Collins Group.
And honestly, having Seppi's background notes, it really elevates this beyond just a dry, government white paper.
Probably.
Because we get this front row seat into the exact engineering mindset that's required to solve a catastrophic problem, but using off-the-shelf consumer technology.
Yeah, I found myself getting so hooked by the almost like a MacGyver-like ingenuity of his approach.
Yeah, very much so.
But before we even get to his satellite solution, I think we really need to understand the problem on the ground first.
Right.
Because we use terrestrial mobile networks every single day, right? To stream video, to navigate traffic, make video calls. And to us, they generally feel invincible.
Sure.
So why is the Finnish government so incredibly terrified of relying on these cell towers during a crisis? Well, they feel invincible to you because you only interact with them under optimized everyday conditions.
Right. Normal Tuesdays.
Exactly. The terrestrial networks are engineered for average, predictable human behavior.
Okay.
But the fundamental premise of this entire research is that, especially in the shadow of ongoing global events, we have to assume civilian communications will fail. And the crazy thing is, the most common cause of that failure isn't some massive bomb or a sophisticated cyber attack.
Really? What is it?
It's human panic.
Panic. Really? Because, I mean, I can download a massive 4K movie file on my phone in 2 minutes on a normal day.
Right.
Why does that exact same network just completely collapse just because a few hundred people in a square mile try to read a basic text news alert during an emergency? It feels like the network should just automatically scale up.
Well, it comes down to the actual physical limitations of how a cell tower manages wireless traffic.
Right.
So a mobile network access point only has a finite amount of radio frequency spectrum. Think of them as like invisible lanes on a highway. Now, to allow hundreds of phones to use those exact same lanes simultaneously, the tower uses a technique called time slicing.
Time slicing?
Yeah, it literally chops the radio signal into these microscopic fractions of a second. So it's rapidly switching its attention back and forth between your phone, your neighbor's phone, the person down the street, and so on.
Okay, so it's sort of dealing out data like a dealer handing out cards at a blackjack table, just doing it millions of times a second.
That is actually a highly accurate way to visualize it, yes.
Okay.
So now factor in an emergency.
Right.
Some massive incident occurs, and suddenly every single user in a 3-mile radius grabs their device at the exact same millisecond.
Oh, man.
And they're all demanding a card from the dealer at the exact same time.
Right.
The tower's backhaul, which is the computer actually sorting this traffic, becomes completely overwhelmed trying to allocate those microscopic time slices.
So the dealer gets swamped by 1,000 people and just drops the entire deck.
Literally drops the deck. The physical manifestation of this is what we call complete packet saturation.
Okay.
So the latency just skyrockets because your data packets are essentially waiting in this massive invisible digital queue just to be recognized by the tower.
Wow.
And so the connection either slows to an unusable crawl or, honestly, the network simply drops the connections entirely just to protect its own core hardware from physically crashing.
That's terrifying.
It is. The architecture is just mathematically incapable of handling 100% of its user base transmitting simultaneously. It wasn't built for that.
Right. And I have to assume governments already know this, right? Which is why first responders don't use the same 5G network that I use to scroll social media.
Exactly.
The sources mention official Tetra networks, and in Finland, they use this specific system called VERV.
Yes, Merv.
So if the civilian network drops, why can't the civilian broadcasters, the people whose literal job it is to keep the public informed, why can't they just jump on that secure emergency network with the police?
It's a great question, but it comes down to how traditional Tetra networks are physically designed.
Okay.
So Tetra stands for terrestrial trunked radio, and it was built for highly secure, highly reliable voice communications.
Like walkie-talkies.
Right. Voice and maybe really short text bursts between police, fire, military units. And to do that reliably, it operates on narrowband frequencies.
Narrowband?
Yeah, and narrowband is fantastic for, punching a voice signal through thick concrete walls or dense forests. It's incredibly robust, but it has a very, very low data capacity.
Okay, so an emergency worker can hit a button and say, send an ambulance to Main Street, and that gets through instantly.
Exactly.
Instant. But if a news organization tries to push like a high-definition live video feed or heavy radio audio streams to a national transmitter over that exact same network.
It would be like trying to force a fire hose volume of water through a tiny cocktail straw.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the Tetra networks physically cannot carry the broadband data that is required by modern broadcasters.
Right.
Which means if the civilian network drops due to human panic, the national broadcasters are completely cut off from the outside world, even if the police radios next to them are working perfectly.
So the broadcast goes dead right when people need it most.
Exactly.
And the researchers actually noted this exact bottleneck. They mentioned that the Finnish company behind VERV, Erillisverkot Oyosreed, they clearly saw this issue, and they developed a second-generation system aptly called VERV2.
Right, VERV2.
And this upgrade actually operates on broadband, so it acts like a regular modern mobile data network. And the really clever part is that it has a built-in prioritization protocol.
Yes.
So if I understand the sources correctly, if a police officer and a random civilian both try to use data at the exact same time, the system automatically forces the official traffic through and throttles the civilian.
That's exactly right. On paper, VERV2 solves the data saturation problem perfectly.
Right.
The official VIPs get digital right away.
Makes sense.
But when you look at the actual physical deployment of VERV2, you uncover this massive, glaring architectural flaw.
Which is that it uses the exact same physical cell towers as the civilian network.
Yes. It operates from the identical physical infrastructure.
Wow.
The prioritization is merely software logic running on the exact same hardware in the woods.
So it's basically like having a dedicated, painted VIP lane on a massive suspension bridge.
Good analogy. Yeah.
Like, if there is a huge traffic jam because everyone is fleeing a city, that VIP lane is incredibly useful. The government vehicles can just zip right past the gridlock.
Right.
But if an antagonist plants an explosive and blows up the physical bridge support pillars, it doesn't matter how exclusive your VIP lane is.
No, it doesn't.
The bridge is gone and everyone goes into the water.
Exactly. The medium carrying the traffic is completely destroyed. Software prioritization cannot fix a physical hardware failure.
Right.
And the research highlights an incredibly sobering case study to prove that we aren't just talking about, sophisticated military drone strikes taking out these bridges.
No.
We were talking about basic, low-level vandalism.
Oh, right. The 2024 Janakala incident. Yes. Which, for context, Janakala is this town in Finland, and one morning they just woke up to find their entire mobile communications grid dead. A massive telecommunications tower had completely collapsed.
Right.
But the report stresses that it wasn't a cyber attack. Nobody hacked into a mainframe or, used military ordnance.
No, the perpetrators used physical tools, likely just basic bolt cutters, or maybe a battery-powered angle grinder from a hardware store.
That's insane.
Well, think about how these towers are built. Telecommunication towers, especially those really tall ones used for wide-area rural coverage, they're often held upright by a network of tension guy wires.
Right, the ballast wire.
Yeah. These thick steel cables that anchor the mast to the ground in a wide radius to counteract wind resistance.
Okay, so they didn't even attack the complex electronics at the base. They just walked out into the woods, up to the anchor points, and cut the steel cables.
That's it. By severing the tension on just one side, gravity and the immense weight of the tower itself did the rest of the work. The mast buckled, crashed to the ground, and instantly destroyed the antennas and the fragile fiber optic connections at the base.
Just like that.
An entire town lost its critical communications infrastructure due to a shockingly low-tech physical attack.
And I think the most unnerving detail in the report is that authorities believe this wasn't even a state-sponsored sabotage mission. It was likely just teenagers or local vandals.
Exactly. And the conclusion the researchers draw from this is absolutely chilling.
Yeah.
If a random person with hardware-scored tools can sever the communications for an entire town in a matter of minutes, the terrestrial grid is fundamentally indefensible against a coordinated hostile state actor.
Right.
Centralized infrastructure, fixed towers on a map that you can physically walk right up to is just an inherent vulnerability.
Right, because you can't post a military guard at every single cell tower in a country.
You just can't.
So if the ground is that fragile, you are forced to look somewhere else. You basically have to abandon the ground, which is exactly what led Mika Seppi and his team out into the freezing wilderness to test the sky.
Right. They needed a decentralized solution, so they turned to low Earth orbit satellites. But critically, and this is what makes Seppi's approach so brilliant, they didn't test this in some controlled, comfortable laboratory environment in Helsinki.
No, not at all.
Between December 2024 and March 2025, Seppi conducted this grueling series of field tests to see if a commercial Starlink system could truly function as the backbone of a nation's emergency broadcast grid.
And the sheer geographical scale of this field test is just wild.
It's massive.
Like, they started in the extreme north at the Raja Giuseppe border crossing, and they went all the way down to the Valima crossing in the deep south. And the documentation points out that the physical distance straight down between these points is about 860 kilometers.
Right, but if you are actually driving those winding winter roads, it's closer to 1,180 kilometers of travel.
Wow. And just to put that in perspective for you listening, that is roughly the distance from Seattle all the way down to San Francisco. Yeah. Or, if you are in Europe, from London to Barcelona. They were dragging this fragile satellite equipment across a massive slice of the Earth during the harshest, darkest months of the year.
Well, but testing across that vast spread was absolutely vital for the statistical integrity of the research.
Why is that?
Because earlier tests, back in 2023, had been conducted in Western Finland.
Yeah.
But at that time, Starlink hadn't actually deployed enough satellites in polar trajectories yet to ensure mission-critical uptime at high latitudes.
Ah, okay.
Right, so by testing at these extreme northern and southern points simultaneously, Seppi could actually prove whether the newly launched polar satellites provided a seamless, continuous blanket of coverage over the entire sovereign territory.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right.
But to me, the distance still isn't the craziest part of the methodology. It is the highly specific locations they chose.
The border station.
Right. They didn't just go to random snowy fields. They went to active and some closed border stations directly adjacent to Russia.
Yes.
And the documentation is very clear. It says at certain testing points, the Starlink dish was operating less than a single meter from the physical Russian borderline.
That's bold.
I honestly struggled to comprehend the audacity of this because we are talking about the winter of 2025. This is in the direct, literal shadow of the ongoing war in Ukraine.
Right.
Why on earth would you risk deploying an advanced Western satellite communication device literally inches from a hostile superpower?
Well, it reveals the intense geopolitical anxiety that's actually underlying this research.
Okay.
They were looking for an invisible digital wall.
What do you mean?
So Starlink, as a corporate entity, utilizes geofencing.
Right, to restrict where it works.
Exactly. They use GPS bounding boxes and internal cellular logic within the satellite terminals themselves to ensure their service is entirely deactivated within the borders of Russia, complying with international sanctions.
Okay, so Seppi wanted to know if that digital fence somehow bled over the physical border.
Precisely that. If the geofencing logic was even slightly imprecise, a civilian dish operating just a few meters inside Finland might mistakenly register as being in Russia and just instantly shut down.
Wow.
Furthermore, they were testing the resilience against active signal jamming.
Right.
Because in an active conflict zone, hostile forces elevate the radio frequency noise floor. They are essentially screaming on the exact same invisible frequencies the satellite uses just to drown out the signal.
And they needed to know if that jamming would bleed across the border and knock out the Finnish responders.
Yes.
Because if an emergency happens on the border, the military and the broadcasters are going to be standing right on the border. It doesn't help anyone if the backup system only works 10 miles inland.
Exactly. The field test was specifically designed to find the absolute edge of that digital cliff.
And what did they find?
The results they gathered were profound. They discovered no boundaries. Yeah. The Starlink service remained completely stable, continuously tracking satellites and pushing heavy data, even while physically brushing up against a territory where the system is strictly prohibited and actively, aggressively suppressed.
That is wild, because I honestly expected a commercial dish, like something you just buy off a website, to completely buckle under the weight of an emergency broadcast.
Sure.
I mean, a home internet connection is one thing, but running a national radio and television feed, how did the actual performance numbers look when they pushed it?
Surprisingly fantastic.
Yeah.
And the physics of low Earth orbit provide a massive advantage here compared to older tech.
Okay.
Traditional geostationary satellites, the big ones we used to use, orbit at about 35,000 kilometers above the Earth.
That's really far.
Right. And because the data has to travel that massive distance up and back down, you inherently suffer a ping or latency of about 600 milliseconds.
And that delay makes live two-way broadcasting incredibly jarring, right? It's like watching a news anchor ask a field reporter a question, and the reporter just stares blankly at the camera for a full second before answering.
Exactly, that awkward pause.
Mm.
But LEO satellites, like the Starlink constellation, they orbit much, much closer, typically around just 550 kilometers up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Because the physical distance is so much shorter, Seppi logged median latency times of just 50 to 55 milliseconds.
That's nothing.
Right. That is virtually indistinguishable from a standard terrestrial fiber connection.
And what about the actual speed? Could it handle a heavy data load like video?
The bandwidth was ample. In these freezing remote conditions, they recorded download speeds ranging from 150 to 350 megabits per second and upload sitting nicely between 20 and 35 millipeas.
Wow.
The researchers noted this is more than enough overhead to seamlessly push a 4K video live feed straight from the field.
That's incredible.
And for radio broadcasting, which requires significantly less data, they calculated you could run hundreds of high-quality audio streams simultaneously on a single consumer dish.
Okay, now, you mentioned a term earlier. I saw it in the sources that I really want to clarify. Jitter adaptation.
Yes.
The report says modern broadcasting software can use this to handle satellite inconsistencies. What exactly is jitter, and how does the software fix it?
Okay, so when you send data over a network, it gets chopped into tiny little packets.
Right.
In a perfect world, those packets arrive at the destination in a perfectly steady, rhythmic stream. Bum, bum, bum. But a satellite network is highly dynamic. The dish on the van is constantly switching its invisible connection from one satellite zooming overhead to the next one coming over the horizon.
Right, handing it off.
Exactly. And that handoff causes microscopic delays in packet delivery. That variance in arrival time, the fact that it's not perfect rhythmic, it's called jitter.
Okay, so the data is arriving, but it's stuttering.
Correct.
Yeah.
But modern broadcasting software uses jitter adaptation, which is essentially a dynamic digital buffer.
A buffer.
Yeah. It holds the first few incoming packets for just a fraction of a second before actually playing them out loud, creating this tiny, invisible reservoir of data.
Oh, I see.
So if the network stutters for a millisecond during a satellite handoff, the software just pulls from the reservoir, smoothing out the transmission so the listener at home never actually hears a drop in the audio.
That is so smart. Okay, so the technical specs are fantastic.
They are.
But this brings me to a massive point of friction that I had while reading this.
Okay.
If you are a sovereign nation state, and you have acknowledged that the ground is vulnerable to basic sabotage, and you need a highly resilient satellite network, why on earth are you relying on a commercial product you can buy at a retail store?
Right.
Why not deploy heavily encrypted, ruggedized, proprietary military-grade hardware?
It does seem highly counterintuitive, right? To trust national security to a consumer gadget. But the research specifically addresses this "why not a military-grade solution?" question. And the answer is deeply rooted in a very realistic understanding of human psychology during a catastrophe.
Right, because Seppi argues that in a true crisis, the person actually turning the equipment on probably won't be an IT expert or a military communications officer.
Exactly. The report explicitly states that the end user could just be a random civilian, or a local municipal worker, or a freelance journalist who just happens to be the very first person on the scene.
Yeah.
Keep in mind, from the remote border crossings where they tested, the nearest mid-sized city is a 2-hour drive.
Oh, wow.
You cannot wait 2 hours for a highly trained military technician to arrive and establish a comms link. The crisis is happening now.
You know, this makes me think of an AED like an automated external defibrillator.
Well, that's a perfect comparison.
Yeah, like you see them mounted on the walls in airports and train stations. It does not matter how incredibly advanced the medical technology inside that box is. If the interface requires a medical degree to operate, the patient is going to die while you wait for a cardiologist.
Exactly.
The genius of an AED is that you open the box and a synthesized voice literally tells a completely panicked bystander exactly where to place their hands. It has to be dead simple.
That is a phenomenal analogy for Seppi's exact philosophy, because a military-grade satellite terminal often requires inputting complex decryption keys.
Right.
It requires aligning the dish manually, using coordinates, and navigating proprietary clunky software. Under the extreme stress of a crisis, literally shivering in negative 27-degree weather, a civilian cannot operate that.
They just freeze up.
Literally and figuratively. Starlink, conversely, utilizes a phased array antenna.
Wait, okay, what does that mean? A phased array? Because I noticed it doesn't physically spin around to find the satellite, right?
Right. It has small motors to tilt itself initially, just to get a good angle, but the actual precise tracking is entirely electronic.
Okay.
A phased array contains hundreds of microscopic antennas laid out on a flat panel. By slightly altering the timing, which is the phase of the radio waves emitted by these tiny individual antennas, the dish can electronically steer its signal beam across the sky.
That is so cool.
Yeah. It can track a satellite moving at 27,000 kilometers an hour without the physical dish needing to move a single millimeter. You literally just plug it into a power source, and it does the rest autonomously.
It is entirely plug and play.
Exactly.
And there's a logistical genius to using commercial gear too, right? Ubiquity.
Yes. The supply chain advantage is absolutely massive here.
Because there's so many of them.
Right. If a proprietary military spec cable snaps in a remote location, you have to requisition a specialized replacement from a central defense warehouse.
Which takes days.
But if a consumer satellite cable breaks, you can potentially scavenge a replacement from a nearby town, a local electronics store, or honestly even a neighbor's house.
Wow.
You are essentially turning the commercial retail supply chain into a massive, decentralized national stockpile.
That is brilliant, and you can really see this incredibly pragmatic, boots-on-the-ground reality in the quirks they discovered during these field tests.
Oh, yeah.
My favorite detail in the report was about the antenna heading, because the official instruction manual for Starlink, written by engineers in California, tells the user to point the dish either northwest or southwest.
Right.
But when Seppi's team actually set it up out in the snow in northern Finland, that didn't work optimally at all.
No, they discovered that the actual physical truth of the network in that highly specific geographic region required the antenna to be pointed at exactly 0 degrees north.
Just straight north.
Straight north.
And you only learn that by completely ignoring the corporate manual and testing it in the mud or, in this case, the snow. And then there was the physical mounting. They strapped this thing to a 3.8-meter metal pole on the side of the transit van. I initially assumed that was just to get the dish above the tree line to see the sky better.
A lot of people assume that, but no.
Yeah.
The engineering logic was entirely focused on unpredictable human behavior.
Okay, how so?
They mounted it at 3.8 meters, specifically so that emergency personnel could comfortably walk underneath it.
Walk underneath it. Why does that matter?
Because gigahertz radio waves are highly susceptible to being absorbed by the water in human bodies.
Ooh.
Yes. If the dish is sitting on the ground, every single time a panicked responder walks past it, their body absorbs some of the signal and the broadcast degrades.
That's crazy.
Now, a traditional overthinking engineer might try to solve that with complex frequency filtering or digital correction.
Right.
Seppi solved it by just putting the device on a really tall stick.
That perfectly encapsulates his quote from the source material. It's so good. He says, "The success of an innovation should be measured by the quality of the problem it solves, not the sophistication of how it solves it."
It is such a refreshing way to look at technology.
It really is. And to truly appreciate how elegant this entire preparedness plan is, I think we have to examine the mind that authored it.
Right, Mika Seppi?
Yes, because the sources provide quite a bit of background on him. And his resume explains exactly why he approaches national security issues like a rogue audio engineer rather than a traditional defense contractor.
Well, he is currently the head of technology for Freeman, right?
Right.
Which is the tech branch of the Collins Group.
Yes.
But critically, from 2024 to 2025, he was a technical producer for Radio Suomi at Yale, the Finnish broadcasting company.
Right.
And in his notes, he describes his work as sitting at the intersection of predictability and creativity.
Yeah.
He explicitly says he passionately hates things that work by accident.
Yes. And his specialty seems to be these fully autonomous media solutions. The sources mention his development of an engine called A26, which drives a platform known as AirCore.
Right.
And apparently this was born from a realization he had while literally sitting in these remote freezing locations. He realized humans were just wasting valuable time on manual, repetitive, technical tasks.
Sure.
So he built a fully autonomous radio platform that manages all the technical execution itself, freeing the actual humans to focus on the journalism and the crisis management.
And he also designed something called OB1.
Oh, yeah.
Which is fascinating. So outside broadcast vans, the massive, heavy trucks that news stations use to broadcast in the field, they are incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
And they require a highly specialized technical crew to operate.
Right? They're huge.
So OB1 is his solution to that.
Yeah.
It's a virtual replacement that literally fits in a small case. He claims it does everything a $1 million van does, but the on-air talent could just set it up themselves.
Wow.
Again, we see this relentless, obsessive focus on removing the technical barrier for the end user.
Which brings us to a story from his background notes that I just loved. It perfectly illustrates this Rolling Stone philosophy of engineering he has. It's the story of the phase-canceled audio problem.
Oh, that is a fantastic example.
And I'm going to need you to explain the actual physics of it for everyone listening.
Right.
What exactly is a double mono 180-degree phase difference?
Okay, so think of an audio signal as a physical waveform, like ripples in a pond.
Okay.
It has peaks where the sound pressure is high, and it has troughs where the pressure is low.
Right.
Now, in a standard stereo audio file, you have a left channel and a right channel. A double mono file just means the exact same audio is playing perfectly on both sides.
Like listening to a podcast where my voice is exactly the same in your left ear and your right ear?
Correct. Now, imagine taking the right channel's waveform and flipping it completely upside down.
Okay.
So every time the left channel has a peak going up, the right channel has a trough going down of the exact same size. They're perfectly opposite. In audio engineering, this is called being 180 degrees out of phase.
Okay, so what happens if you actually listen to that?
Well, if you listen on stereo headphones, one in each ear, it sounds very strange and wide, but you can still hear the audio.
Okay.
The absolute catastrophe happens if those two channels are ever mixed or summed back together into a single mono channel.
Why?
Because when a peak going up meets an inverted trough going down at the exact same size, They mathematically cancel each other out to absolute zero.
Wow.
The result is pure, dead silence. There is no audio.
And the media house Seppi was working at had a recurring nasty bug where this inverted out-of-phase audio would accidentally get pushed to the live broadcast chain.
Yes, and it caused total panic.
Yes.
Because the studio's off-air monitor, which is the physical speaker the radio presenter uses in the booth to listen to what is actually going out over the airwaves, that monitor was a mono speaker.
Oh, no.
It was summing the left and right channels together.
Right.
So the presenter would be talking into the microphone, but the monitor would output dead silence. The presenter would assume the entire national broadcast system had failed, and they'd start making these panic phone calls to the engineering department.
Meanwhile, anyone listening at home in their car on a mono FM receiver was also just hearing dead air.
Exactly. Now, a traditional, sophisticated engineering response to this problem would be to purchase a rack of very expensive, dedicated hardware phase meters, or to install complex digital signal processors that constantly analyze the phase correlation across the entire broadcast chain.
Basically, throw a massive budget at the problem.
Right, but Seppi rejected that. He didn't want to be on call 24/7 just to push a phase invert button whenever this random bug occurred.
Yeah.
So he looked at the architecture and he realized the audio was passing through a web browser interface at one specific point in the chain. So he just wrote a remarkably basic JavaScript widget.
How did a snippet of web code fix a live audio broadcast?
The code simply intercepted the audio node right in the browser. It mathematically added the sequential digital samples of the left and right channels together.
Okay.
If the resulting number was negative, which mathematically proves the waveforms are inverted and currently canceling each other out, the code simply multiplied one of the channels by -1.
It just flipped the upside-down wave right side up. Automatically.
Automatically, in real time, right before it reached the monitor or the transmitter.
That is so smart.
In his notes, Seppi describes this exact code as being like a stone rolling downhill.
What does he mean by that?
Well, he admits it wasn't elegant, it wasn't some sophisticated multi-layered algorithm, but gravity dictates that a stone rolling downhill will eventually, inevitably reach the bottom.
Right.
The code just worked, silently and perfectly, every time. The panic phone call stopped entirely.
He clearly has zero tolerance for technology that demands unnecessary human attention. Which reminds me, there's a fantastic critique he wrote in the sources about microwave ovens that highlights this exact mindset perfectly.
Oh yes, his thoughts on the endlessly beeping microwave.
It's so funny. He writes in his notes, someone, somewhere, decided the world needed a microwave oven that beeps continuously until you physically remove the food. Thoughtful. In theory. But I don't think there are many people who genuinely forget they put something in the microwave, and if they did, they probably weren't that hungry to begin with.
It is a very funny observation, but it actually reveals the absolute core of his design ethos.
Right.
Technology should not nag you. It should not hold your attention hostage. He fundamentally believes technology should act as a quiet extension of human thought, like a trusted colleague who anticipates exactly what you need without requiring a whole conversation about it.
Which is exactly why a commercial Starlink dish is the ultimate crisis tool for him. It doesn't nag you for decryption keys. You plug it in and it quietly finds the satellites.
Exactly.
But as much as we love this, we do have to look at the dark side of this.
We do.
State preparedness means we cannot just celebrate the ingenuity. We have to ruthlessly interrogate the vulnerabilities. If we abandon the fragile ground towers, we are basically just trading terrestrial vulnerabilities for orbital ones.
That's entirely accurate. The research explicitly identifies 4 major risks to relying on a low Earth orbit network. These are the failure states that could bring this entire theoretical broadcast grid crashing down.
Okay, let's break these down because they are fascinating. The first threat is literally the oldest enemy of electrical engineering, the sun.
Yes.
The report notes the sun has been giving us headaches for 4.6 billion years.
The specific threat here is solar flares or coronal mass ejections.
Right.
These are massive eruptions of plasma and ionizing radiation straight from the sun's surface. Now, down here on the ground, the Earth's magnetic field acts as this massive invisible shield, deflecting the worst of this radiation away from us.
Right. We just get pretty northern lights out of it.
Exactly. But satellites in low Earth orbit are operating on the very outer edge of that protective bubble. When a severe solar flare hits the Earth, it interacts with our upper atmosphere, causing the atmosphere to actually heat up and physically expand outward into space.
Wait, so the atmosphere gets thicker right where the satellites are flying?
Yes, and this drastically increases the atmospheric drag on the satellites.
Hmm.
Keep in mind, they are moving at roughly 27,000 kilometers per hour.
Right.
When they hit that thicker air, they experience massive friction, they lose orbital velocity, and gravity simply pulls them down to burn up in the atmosphere.
Wow.
Plus, the ionizing radiation itself can physically flip the bits in the satellite's computers, instantly corrupting their navigation systems.
And the research points out that this isn't just a hypothetical fear. In early 2022, a solar storm hit right after Starlink had launched a new batch of satellites, and the increased drag caused dozens of them to just fall right back out of the sky and burn up.
And the timeline of this specific research is critical here. The sun operates on an 11-year cycle of magnetic activity. The expected peak of the current cycle, what we call the solar maximum, is occurring right now, across 2024 and 2025.
Oh, wow.
This means the statistical risk of catastrophic solar weather degrading the constellation is currently at its highest point in over a decade.
So the sun is actively trying to melt the network.
Basically.
Okay, risk number 2 is a bit more localized to orbit, but it's arguably scarier because it is entirely a man-made problem. Space debris.
Yes. This introduces the concept of the Kessler syndrome. Low Earth orbit is, quite frankly, rapidly becoming a high-speed landfill.
Yeah.
It is littered with dead satellites, spent rocket booster stages, and literally thousands of fragments of metal from previous collisions.
We tend to think of space as, empty. But the math behind this is terrifying. How fast is this trash actually moving?
Well, orbital velocity in LEO is about 7.8 kilometers per second.
Per second.
Yes. If two objects cross paths in opposite directions, the closing speed is astronomical. Because kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared, the velocity is the dominant destructive factor.
Yeah.
At those speeds, an object the size of a fleck of paint carries the exact kinetic energy of a bowling ball moving at highway speeds.
A flag of paint.
Yes. A small metal bolt will completely shatter a satellite upon impact.
And the Kessler syndrome is a chain reaction, right?
It is an exponential cascade.
Yeah.
If a dead Russian weather satellite collides with an old American rocket body, they don't just, dent each other.
Right.
The hypervelocity shatter, creating thousands of new, completely untrackable shrapnel fragments.
Oh, man.
Those fragments spread out and destroy other satellites, creating millions of fragments. The fear is that a single major collision event could trigger a cascade that renders low Earth orbit entirely impassable for generations, which would instantly destroy the entire Starlink network.
The report does mention that humanity is developing methods to clear some of this debris, but it clearly remains a massive sword hanging over any EO-dependent strategy. Okay, let's move back down into the atmosphere for the third risk, the weather. Specifically, water. You mentioned earlier that human bodies block gigahertz signals because we are mostly water. What happens when the sky fills with water?
You experience what's known as rain fade.
Rain fade.
Yeah, it's a fundamental physics problem regarding the electromagnetic spectrum. Commercial satellite internet operates on high-frequency gigahertz bands, specifically the Ku and Ka bands.
Okay.
The physical wavelength of these radio signals happens to be very, very close to the physical size of a raindrop.
Oh, really? So they interact physically?
Yes. When a gigahertz radio wave hits a water molecule in the air, it causes the molecule to vibrate, which generates a microscopic amount of heat.
Okay.
The radio wave is literally transferring its energy into the water. This is called molecular resonance. So the signal is actively absorbed by the rain or by wet, heavy snow falling low in the atmosphere.
So during a heavy spring rainstorm in Finland, the signal from the sky just gets soaked up before it even reaches the dish on the van.
Precisely. The signal attenuates, meaning it heavily weakens. For the end user, this manifests as drastically reduced bandwidth and severe packet jitter.
Right.
And while you cannot engineer your way out of the weather, it is at least meteorologically predictable.
That's true.
Which allows state broadcasters to temporarily scale down their video quality during a known storm just to keep the vital audio feeds running.
Okay, so we have the sun, orbital shrapnel, and rainstorms. The final vulnerability is arguably the most complex because it involves human geopolitics, antagonists, and sovereignty.
Yes. The report states very clearly that hostile entities will always seek to disrupt critical communications. But the much deeper vulnerability here isn't just active signal jamming on the border.
What is it?
It is the corporate origin of the network itself. Starlink is owned and entirely operated by a private commercial entity based in the United States.
Right. And for a sovereign European nation, handing the absolute keys to your emergency broadcast infrastructure to a foreign corporation is a massive geopolitical gamble.
It is the ultimate question of digital sovereignty. If Finland relies entirely on an American system, their national security becomes deeply, dangerously entangled with foreign corporate policy, U.S. government regulations, and, honestly, the personal whims of the corporation's ownership.
Yeah.
If the political winds shift across the Atlantic, the service could be degraded or geofenced entirely, without the Finnish government having any recourse whatsoever.
Which perfectly explains this highly emphasized section in the research suggesting that European equivalents are absolutely necessary for the long term.
Yes.
They explicitly mention that testing of the Airbus OneWeb system, which is a European-operated satellite constellation, began in the spring of 2025, specifically to ensure the EU retains control over its own digital lifelines.
Exactly. It's about maintaining sovereign control.
But looking at all four of these massive risks, I have to push back a bit on the core premise of this entire deep dive.
Okay, let's hear it.
We started by looking at how fragile a cell tower in Janakala is, because a random teenager with a bolt cutter can knock it down. But if we migrate the emergency broadcast network to the sky, a solar flare can fry the hardware. The orbit is filling up with hypervelocity trash that could trigger a cascade failure. A heavy rainstorm chokes the bandwidth. And the entire system is controlled by a foreign corporation.
Yes.
Are we genuinely any safer relying on LEO satellites than we were relying on terrestrial towers?
It is a totally valid, critical challenge to the research. But the philosophy of true state preparedness isn't about discovering an invincible, flawless technology.
Okay.
Because every single engineering solution, whether terrestrial or orbital, has a defined failure state.
So if everything is flawed, what is the actual strategy here?
The strategy is overlapping redundancy through non-unified systems.
For unified systems?
Yes. If your state's only plan relies on centralized ground towers, you have a singular, catastrophic point of failure. When the towers fall, the state goes completely dark.
Right.
But if you maintain those terrestrial towers, and you actively deploy a massive fleet of decentralized commercial LEO satellite terminals, and you integrate a European alternative like OneWeb, you create a highly resilient, diverse ecosystem of survival.
Because it is statistically impossible for a teenager with a bolt cutter, a massive solar flare, and a corporate policy shift to all happen at the exact same millisecond.
Precisely. The final conclusion of the report summarizes it beautifully. It says, being prepared for the worst means we're prepared for anything.
Wow.
The goal isn't to avoid failure entirely. That's impossible. The goal is to mathematically ensure that no single vector of failure is fatal to the nation's ability to communicate.
You know, that completely reframes the entire experiment for me.
Yeah.
It is about layering imperfect, highly pragmatic solutions on top of each other until they form an unbreakable safety net.
Exactly.
It really synthesizes the entire journey we've explored today. I mean, we started by analyzing those centralized vulnerable cell towers in the woods.
Right.
We moved to that freezing border crossing in Varshis, placing a dish 1 single meter from Russia to test the physical and geopolitical limits of a commercial network.
And we unpack the realization that keeping a society informed during a total collapse doesn't actually require a multi-billion-dollar military apparatus.
No.
It requires an off-the-shelf commercial dish on a 3.8-meter pole, chosen specifically because a panicked civilian can turn it on without a manual, acting as an intuitive extension of their own thinking.
It is genuinely a masterclass in human-centered engineering.
It really is.
But before we wrap up entirely, you touched on the issue of corporate ownership earlier, and I know that sparks a much larger, almost philosophical question about the future.
It does. The research really forces us to confront a highly uncomfortable modern dilemma.
Yeah.
We have established that the absolute future of crisis communication relies on simplicity, ubiquity, and orbital technology. But as sovereign nations inevitably abandon their fragile, localized ground infrastructure to rely on satellite constellations owned by private foreign corporations, what happens to the very concept of national sovereignty?
That's a heavy question.
It is. In the ultimate crisis, when a nation is fighting for its literal, physical survival, does control of the nation's voice belong to the democratically elected state, or does it belong to the private corporation that owns the sky?
That is an incredibly complex and honestly slightly unnerving thought to leave on, but it is exactly the kind of invisible reality we need to be analyzing. Next time you connect to a network, take a moment to consider the immense, fragile infrastructure you are relying on, where it lives, who controls it, and what your backup plan is if it all suddenly goes quiet. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.